Hey, fellow Shakespearean scholars, Alan here, and I am going to take you on a quickie tour of the Royal Shakespeare Company's education page. And the first thing that I thought of as I was going through this and looking at all the really cool things that the Royal Shakespeare Company does for education is that this is an amazing resource if you teach in the United Kingdom. For instance, I'm just going to real quick show you these free school broadcasts, and they like broadcast like you set it up. They basically live stream in a performance of one of their shows. I think you can even kind of request one of the shows. Um, they give you information how to prep your students for this, things like this. If it doesn't work in your school, they broadcast the cinema. They do kind of a live Q&A with actors. It's really cool, but as far as I can tell, it is not open to international people. There is a time difference, so I'll give them a little bit of leeway on that. And there's a couple of things. It's like, wow, if you were an educator in England or maybe the United Kingdom in general, there's some really cool stuff on here. But fortunately for us, it's not limited to just that. There are a couple of things that I really want to point out on this website. The first thing that I'll show you is the Shakespeare Learning Zone. And again, you do have to scroll quite a bit in this website. I think that's one of the main drawbacks of this website, but there is some really good stuff on here. The Shakespeare Learning Zone has not all of the plays, but I would say a good number of the ones that are most commonly taught, at least from what I know. So we have Hamlet, Julius Caesar, King Lear, Macbeth, Much Ado About Nothing, Othello, Romeo and Juliet, The Tempest, and Twelfth Night. They does say here that they're going to be adding more plays in the future. So from that standpoint, this is pretty exciting. But right now, these are the ones that we have. And I'm going to go and show you what they have here through Macbeth. One thing that I really like about this is that they have kind of the four main sections here: story, characters, language, and staging. And they have level 1, new to the play. They have level 2, where you can get more detailed information. And then level 3, in-depth study and analysis. And I think this is really cool because, for instance, if you have different levels of learners in your classroom, like I do, you might tell some of your maybe your more struggling readers, why don't you go find something in this level 1? And then you could tell your more medium ones, go find something in level 2, and then you could assign something out of level 3 for your advanced readers or kids that are really looking to do a deep dive. And I'll show you what I mean here. In level 1, in the story where it says a simple overview of the plot of Macbeth, and Macbeth is a crazy plot. It's one of the reasons why it's one of my favorite Shakespeare plays. It narrows it down to, I believe it is 10 plot points, starting with the battle in Scotland, and Macbeth and Banquo meet the three wishes, and then the prophecies starting to become true, Lady Macbeth persuading Macbeth to murder King Duncan in his sleep, and then it goes downhill from there. I'm assuming we all know that I'm assuming you're all familiar with the plot of Macbeth, but it distills it down into 10 main plot points, and that gives you a version of Macbeth. If you go into level 2, it gives you a timeline of the play, which you see is a little bit more detailed, starting with the witches meeting, Macbeth the warrior. Here's a key scene, and you can kind of click on these, and it gives you just a little bit more information. And you see, here it talks about how Macbeth has doubts, which is missing from part 1, things like that. And so it goes a little bit more advanced. Then if you scroll down to level 3, it gives scene by scene descriptions. So you click on Act 1, Scene 1, and it gives you over there and talks about the three witches gathering, and they plan to meet Macbeth, and what do we learn? And it gives a little bit of that. So that takes a look at kind of the plot of Macbeth. What I find is interesting in these things is that it can go much further than that, even. And one of the things that I think is really interesting is staging, especially because we have talked in this class already about performance pedagogy. And so when we look at the settings of plays, I think this is where some things get really kind of cool. Was setting and staging of the play. This is in level 1, and it gives really simplistic information again. Scotland is ruled by a king. Scotland, there's a belief in supernatural forces and witchcraft, including spirits, things like that. Down to there are 2 nearby countries in England and Ireland. England eventually helps Malcolm to raise an army and defeat Macbeth. So it gives a lot of context to what's going on. In the play, the setting, things like that, and then how it does that. All of these sections have teacher notes that kind of give you a little bit of background information on like this. You can use these pictures as a starting point to discuss what they know about the setting of the play and to think about where they would set the play if they were creating their own production. And I think that is a really cool takeaway because modernizing Shakespeare plays is a fairly common assessment when we teach Shakespeare, especially to high school kids. If we go into staging in level 2, it talks a little bit about how they have done it in the past, and it gives information about that. And again, here's some things to consider, such as what their parents reveals about the supernatural in the play. In this 2011 production, the witches are children and are flown onto the stage as hanging corpses. I now really wish I could watch that. That sounds awesome. And then it asks, what does this decision do to the telling of the story? How does staging affect it? Because these plays are not just words on a page, they're plays. There's action that goes on. Then if you go down to the level 3, the more in-depth study and analysis for 3, this is where it's going to ask your students some really cool questions. And these questions are echoed in level 1 and level 2. For instance, in the supernatural, how can you help modern audiences to believe in the witches and the supernatural? Is the magic used by the witches real? How much do the characters in the play believe in magic and witchcraft? How will you stage them? So if you were going to have them either come up with their own scenes or modernize it, these are questions they can ask them. I think this is a hugely important question. How do you show the apparition of the dagger? Is it something visible to the audience, or is it just in Macbeth's mind? I think that's a really important question. And you can ask students this question: is the dagger real or not? And what are the consequences if it is or not? You can also look at status in society. How do people become thanes and lords? If you're going to modernize it, what's your equivalent? How do people become that? Are there visual ways that status is shown to others? So what's the costuming that you have going on? And then again, there's teacher notes here, and this looks at the key decisions that a director makes. And I think when you get to level 3, it starts to shift from this is what people have traditionally done to what would you do if you were to stage this. Next is challenge your students to think how they would want to tell the story of Macbeth. How would they respond to the questions here? And these, I think, are really cool questions that you could ask, especially when you talk about performance pedagogy. One of the things that you can do here too is they have links to some of the casebooks from their earlier productions. I'm just going to click on the 1999 one just to kind of show you this really quick. And it talks about the staging. It gives some background on this. And these are things that I think you could give to students, show them production. I think this is a really cool picture of Duncan, how they staged that. I think that's really cool. And I think these are things that you could even show your class before you read the play. And you say, okay, who do you think this character is? And your students probably say, they're important. Why do we know? And it's getting them to pay attention to things like that. And then you can compare, say, this picture of Duncan in all his majesty to, these two, Macbeth and Ross. And you could say, how are they depicted as being lower class, for instance, than Duncan? Things like that. And then here's Lady Macbeth and Duncan as well. I zoomed in quite a bit there. I'm sorry. And so those are really cool production photos. And then it talks about the modern setting, the creepy effects that they have with it. And then I think these are things that you can take through with the class or have them explore and have them do what they see and what they find, things like that. So I think that's a really cool thing that they have for the performance of Macbeth if you were going to put it on. Or if you were going to have them compare and contrast, and maybe you say, okay, you don't see all of the stuff in Macbeth. We're not going to watch an entirely new version of Macbeth, but looking at these pictures, is there something that you like in there and how they set things up? So that's a little bit about the Shakespearean Learning Zone or the Shakespeare Learning Zone. Again, I wish there were more plays. Probably the most commonly taught ones are going to be in here. And then you can kind of follow the links for that. What I'm trying to avoid as I do this screencast is doing a really deep dive down the rabbit hole, because you can see there are links upon links upon links, and you can follow things for probably literally days, finding really cool stuff. I just want to give you kind of an overview of the beginning and how you can get there. The next thing that I'm going to show you, the other major thing that they have, real quick, just as I'm thinking about as I scroll by here, this certificate in teaching Shakespeare as international teachers, we could do that. It does cost us a little bit more, but it didn't sound too unreasonable when I looked at it. So that's something that you could look at. And I think it's like a 3-day fairly intensive course in Stratford upon Avon. So that's something that you could do. Again, a lot of these are for people, teachers in Britain. If you go down to these teacher resources here and you click on that, you can find a lot of really cool stuff. There's teacher packs, interactive whiteboard resources, images and video galleries, things like that. What's really nice about this is that it does have every play. So I'm going to pick Henry IV Part 1, and I'm just going to click on all of these so I can get all of the resources, because that's what I like. I was very ignorant as to what all this meant, the KS1 through KS5, and I kind of figured KS5 is going to be your seniors in high school, and KS1 will maybe be junior high. KS1 is much younger than that. Just an FYI, I think for the most part we all teach junior high and up. So I'm going to level it to KS3 and up. And then it gives you age-appropriate things for that play. And it gives you teacher packs. There's videos so you can watch a performance of it, things like that. It doesn't look like there's a whole lot in King Henry IV. So I'll select a different one here in a little bit too to give you another example. But here is our teacher pack. It does look like, based off of the table of contents here and doing some reading, that it kind of relates to the broadcasts. The broadcast that I told you about at the beginning of the screencast, where they broadcast into your school and they do the Q&A. But there's still some stuff in here where you can really take a look at the play and give you some ideas. And then it has some activities that you can do, or you can adapt. If you're like me, you don't usually run off, say, this teacher pack and hand it out to the kids or something like that, and you want to tweak it and make it your own. So this gives you a good starting point. And then if you track down the resource materials, which I think might be that other thing that we found on that link, you have them watch or read, and what do they learn about the different parts? What do they learn about the state of the nation? I was intrigued very early on in Act 1, Scene 1, that not all is well. It kind of filled my Game of Thrones cravings a little bit as I was reading the beginning of this play, but I'm getting ahead of myself. It gives you things that you can do with context, how are lower class characters portrayed, How do they do that? It gives you a synopsis of the play that you can follow. Here is something that kind of echoes what we saw in that Shakespeare Learning Zone, the story in 10 scenes, but I think it might be having students come up with that. I like this. Allows students some time to create a 1-minute dramatization of their scene using the lines they have been given. Title the scenes, things like that. And so it just goes through here where you can have them talk about characters, giving them quotes from characters. I think it would be really cool to have students do like a freeze frame of, say, Falstaff's "What is honor?" speech. I think that would be really cool. This talks about the world of Prince Hal, the Boar's Head Tavern, things like that. And so it gives you a number of activities. I like this. Ask students to come up with a simile describing the school holidays, which a lot of us are either on or are approaching. And so this would be a cool thing to ask students. Like, how do you celebrate the end of year? Or what do you do in the summer? Why is it a festive time? Things like that. So there's a lot in these teacher packs, and they're 27 pages long. And it just gives, or this one is 27 pages long. I'm only about a third of the way through it. And there's a lot of information in here. I really like this one, the Activity 6, the Father and Son, because it allows students to maybe contextualize something in this history that might be a little bit foreign to them or they just can't relate to, and connect it to their lives. And I think that's one of the key things that the Royal Shakespeare Company does in their resources is it gives a lot of resources and a lot of tips and tricks on maybe making Shakespeare a little bit more accessible to students and discussing in their modern lives. And you can talk about how the king feels about Hal and things like that. And then it goes through Hal and Hotspur, all of that. And so these are just so that's just how you find that, that I thought was really interesting. I'm going to see if I could find a play that has a little bit more to it. I don't know if Merry Wives of Windsor we're going to do, but I am going to go back to Macbeth because I feel like Macbeth is going to have things. And I'm just going to say that I want everything. I'd be very interested to see what a KS1 tool is. Here you see there's a lot more that's in here. Here's a themes resource, themes in Macbeth. And again, it's just going to open up a PDF. This is a lot shorter. I really wish I had known this my first year of teaching because I taught Macbeth and I had never read Macbeth. It was just in the textbook. I thought, oh, Macbeth, it's cool. I had seen it before, but I had never read it. And so I was flying very blind. And I wish I had stuff like this to kind of really contextualize. Here are the themes: ambition, kingship, fate and free will, appearance and reality, things like that. And this is a thing too. You could even put together a packet of this play and give it to your students and say, okay, how do we see this? How do we see motifs of nature? How does nature work in this? Or light and darkness. How does light and darkness factor into Macbeth? The other thing that stuff like this does, if you are teaching multiple Shakespeare plays, and this year, for instance, I taught 4 of them, that's a lot of information to keep in your head, especially because at one point I was teaching 3 of them at the same time. And so it's kind of hard to code switch between these. These are things that either you can use to kind of keep the plays straight in your head or know what you're talking about, or your students can. I think especially because it breaks these things down by acts and scenes, it maybe gives students kind of a Cliff Notes version of where they can find quotes for when they go and do things. So this has past productions. There's the teacher backpack from 2018 for Macbeth, things like that. I'm going to go back and look for one more, look at one more play, just to kind of see what they have. Mostly because I liked teaching a Midsummer Night's Dream this year. It was my first time doing that. But I wish I had a little bit more. And again, here you see themes, resources. Here's a playmaking pack. And it gives you, and it looks like this has edits. So they've cut down the play a little bit. Obviously, I'm not going to go through all 163 pages of this as I go through there. But it looks like they have a lot of really good information in here about that. And then also plays, versions of the play where it's cut down to something that's manageable that you could maybe even have students do. If this one's 30 minutes, they could do that in a class period, things like that. And that allows you to do the performance. Again, as you can tell, there's a big variety, a big difference in some of the plays have a lot, some of the plays don't have as much. But that's looking at the teacher resources as we go on through here. They do have online performances, so you can watch. I think they're mostly their scenes, or this looks like a one-man play of Sin of the Poet, which I think would be real interesting. I'm going to have to keep that in mind for when I teach Julius Caesar again. And if anything, these give you an idea of some things that you could do with your classes to maybe even just introduce the idea of Shakespeare and plays. One thing one thing before I get into the last thing I want to talk about, they do have professional development things for teachers. Again, a lot of these seem to be that coming to your school, things like that, but they do have, I wanted to show you the International Professional Development. And I think even on this, they might come to your school. Personally, as I'm a one-person English department, I don't think I'd get very many people at my school on board with this. But if you teach at a larger school or something like that, this might be something that you could look into. And so I just wanted to show you where you could find that. The other thing that I really wanted to point out and just give a little bit of a shout out to, just because this is something that I really like, is that, and I'm just going to go back to the main education page, is that the Royal Shakespeare Company has taken really an active role in the study of pedagogy, kind of always reflecting on what they're doing. One of the things that I like about this is kind of the mission statement. We're passionate about the impact Shakespeare can have on every young person's life. We work with thousands of young people, teachers, and partners theaters each year who experience the extraordinary power of Shakespeare's language in their school and local community. And then we want all young people to have the opportunity to find their voice through Shakespeare. And I just wanted to really give notice to one last thing. And this isn't necessarily a resource, but I think it shows how committed the Royal Shakespeare Company is to providing solid Shakespeare resources for teachers and ensuring that Shakespeare is accessible to all. And they partnered with one of the universities, I believe, in England, RSC Tate and the University of Nottingham, to do the Time to Listen research, which was a massive undertaking to understand the power and importance of the arts and cultural education. And it really talked about and they had recommendations on it, and it really talked about why these things are important, why arts and cultural education are important. And I think this is something, and I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but if you're ever asked, why do we have to teach, or why are we teaching Shakespeare? It's 2019. There's no need for this anymore. What's the point? This is something that you can pull out and say, here's what the Royal Shakespeare Company does. You can say, they have a bias about it, but they done with this huge survey, and they talked about why arts and culture in a school are important. It talks about how teachers can play an integral part in bringing culture alive, things like that. And so I think it's a really cool thing that they do or they did, and it just really shows the importance of art and culture, and it shows how the Royal Shakespeare Company is really committed to doing that. There was a place where it did talk about the recommendations that they have, but I have lost that. I apologize. I will try to find that. I will put the link up to it. So all in all, just to kind of sum things up here, this is a great resource, not just for teachers in the United Kingdom, but also it's a great resource for us as an American audience. Once again, the Shakespeare Learning Zone, which breaks things up into different tiers and gives you bases of information, and then also the teacher resource page where they do have every play. One thing that I just kind of thought of as I was thinking about this teacher resources, if you're like me and you have most of his plays in the classroom and you encourage students to take a chance on it and do it, you could say like, hey, I'm probably never going to teach measure for measure in a high school class, but maybe a student picks that up because I have some kids that have picked up Shakespeare on their own, and you can say, here, you don't have to fly blind. Just because you have chosen a Shakespeare play that I am not overly familiar with or I haven't gotten around to reading, you don't have to fly blind. Here's teacher resources, peek behind the curtain. This is how other people teach it, and that maybe helps them. And it makes Shakespeare really accessible. And again, looking at their impact and their research that they have on here, that seems to be something that the Royal Shakespeare Company is really all about. I hope this was a thorough look at the Royal Shakespeare Company education website. If you do have any questions or comments, please do let me know. And again, I'm looking forward to talking about this and other things with you all in a couple of weeks when we all get together in Bozeman. Thank you for watching and listening to me ramble on and on and on. Happy hunting through the Royal Shakespeare Company education website.